It's a season of diplomatic maneuvers by China. Beijing is making diplomatic inroads around the world, from Africa to the Philippines to the West Asia. It looks like China has an interest in being seen as an important player in all kinds of regions. But the question is that China is not the only country doing so. The United States of America is also making diplomatic inroads, holding drills with various countries and meeting their leaders. But the bigger question that arises here is, if US will be able to counter China's growing expansionism. For more on this, we are now being joined by Ross Fingold, a political analyst from Taiwan. Thank you so much for joining us in WION, Mr. Ross.
Good afternoon.
Right, so for starters, help us understand the current scenario, where on one hand, the United States of America and the Philippines hold one of its largest joint military drills called Balikatan, while on the other hand, the Chinese foreign minister goes to Manila and meets his Philippines counterpart, with both US and China vying to increase their influence over the Southeast Asian nation. How do you see things panning out from this point?
The Philippines, like a number of other countries and regions around the world, is a place where the U.S. and China are competing for influence. Part of that is in the economic and the trade space, where China is a big trading partner of the Philippines. It's a big investor. Sometimes those investment commitments don't actually become reality. But on the security side, the U.S. and the Philippines are treaty allies, and as evidenced by the recent military exercises and the decision by the Philippines government to grant the U.S. additional access to facilities in the Philippines to pre-position equipment, there's a security relationship that China simply can't match in the Philippines. But then again, that leaves other parts in the world where this competition continues to play out. And then part of it is just the ideological competition. It's are we promoting democracy? And of course, the United States puts itself in that position, supporting good governance, fighting corruption, human rights protection. And then on the other hand, China in its relationships with other countries around the world says we don't interfere in your domestic politics. We don't comment on that. That might not always be the reality, but it's certainly what China says. And being realistic, a lot of countries around the world, they're receptive to that. They want a partner who might bring investment, but is not going to bring the commentary about democracy, rule of law, or human rights issues.
Right, just to follow up to that, Beijing and Manila have also decided to set hotlines to resolve their territorial disputes. Does this hint at how Manila and Beijing are saying that they don't need US interference in the region?
Might be a little too early to draw that conclusion. Again, the Philippines' security relationship is its primary security relationship because of the treaty. We've seen a number of moves in recent weeks and months to enhance that relationship. That's going to continue. And the United States and its partners in the region, whether that's Japan or Australia, and Australia sent observers to the recent military exercise, I think the partners in the region are also welcoming that and encouraging that for the Philippines as well. So the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., when he ran for office a year ago, it seemed like he was going to continue many of the policies of his predecessor, President Duterte, and really try and stay in the middle and not go to one side or the other in U.S.-China disputes. But again, in recent months, he's making moves to enhance the security relationship.
Right, Mr. Ross, you're also joining us live from Taiwan. Shed some light on what is Taiwan's future currently. Is it stuck in a tug of war between US and China?
I wouldn't call it a tug of war in the sense that the current government here in Taiwan has made it very clear where it stands. It's not looking to have a China-friendly policy. It's looking to enhance its relationship with the United States, whether that's in trade and security, as well as what Taiwan often calls like-minded countries, whether that's Japan or India or Australia or countries in Western Europe. So this government, on the trade side, it's encouraging Taiwan businesses to invest in other countries, not in China, to establish better relationships in markets around the world, not in China. And on the security side, again, it's enhancing its relationship with the United States. So I think for the current government, and we'll see what happens in the election that's going to take place here in January, but most likely that the next president as well is going to seek to enhance relationships with the United States and like-minded partners and not with China.
Right, but China is also increasingly growing its footprint around the world, from Africa to the West Asia, now the Philippines. How do you assess China's growing influence in global world affairs currently?
Sometimes China has its victories. Being able to serve as the middleman between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right.
It caught the Biden administration by surprise. And China could say we've had a foreign policy success, and countries in that part of the world are looking to us. And the same thing sometimes happens in Africa, Central and South America. Honduras recently switching diplomatic relations to China. The problem for the United States and Australia and Western Europe is they're there, but they're not really there in the way that China is in some of these other places around the world. China's government officials frequently visit, they stay longer, their companies express an interest in investing, and the approach from the Western countries is often slower and it's shallow, it's not deep. They come for a day or two and say, we want to be partners, and you need to make all these changes to your corruption or human rights or democracy institutions. And China doesn't do that. So it's an ongoing competition. But frankly, if the United States or the Western countries want to win this competition, they have to do a lot more.
Right, Mr. Ross, like you mentioned that Europe, the Western countries and the US are there, but not there, like you mentioned. I want to ask you that what is the roadmap ahead for Washington to counter China's global influence? It recently is planning to open an embassy in Vanuatu. Do you think it will be successful?
Well, it depends on the resources that go into it. And this is just not a matter of just cash resources as well. It's people. And again, if we use the example of, say, a U.S. president, whether that's the current President Biden or previous presidents, Trump, Obama, you got to be there. You can't just visit, say, Africa once or twice a year. You go to 3 countries over 5 or 6 days, which means you're in one country for like a day and a half, and expect them to really fall in love with you. And the same thing happens in Central and South America, which people like to call America's backyard. And sometimes we have U.S. presidents who want to focus on domestic issues. Maybe now their attention, or Biden's attention, is diverted by the war in Ukraine. But he's got to be there. And if you really want to compete with China, you got to spend more time. And well, there's only 24 hours in a day, but you got to put in the time. And again, sometimes we just don't see that from the U.S. government.
You spoke about the war in Ukraine. My next question is just a follow-up to that. Now, America's stance of directly staying away from the ongoing war has created a vacuum. And how do you see China filling in the gap, and what kind of repercussions will it have in the current geopolitics?
Typically in the past, China hasn't sought to play a middleman when there's a war somewhere. They haven't sought to be the peacemaker when there's a hot war. So that's a little bit different than, say, the recent Saudi Arabia-Iran situation. It wasn't really a hot war, even though they were fighting a proxy war in Yemen. But at least directly, the two countries weren't at war. And China's probably a little more comfortable getting involved in that situation. As of now, Zelensky has said, I welcome China's involvement. I want to talk to China, but Xi Jinping he hasn't picked up the phone and called Zelensky yet. It doesn't seem like it's happening anytime soon. It might happen eventually. So China is still being a little bit more careful, but ultimately, look, we know that China has taken Russia's side in this dispute. There's really no debate about that.
Absolutely. There are also rumors that China will provide lethal weapons to Russia, but we'll have to see if that happens or not. My last question before I let you go, Mr. Ross. Do you think that US and China are in an early stage of a new Cold War?
I think it would be a bit too optimistic to say they're not. And then we get into these debates, scholars or politicians say, well, using Cold War it's inflammatory or it's an outdated concept. We need to have a new word. That's fine. We could spend hours debating terminology, but ultimately the two countries are they're competing across a number of spheres, whether that's trade, whether that's ideology, whether that's with the sovereignty disputes in the East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, India border, where the United States, of course, assists India. So there's all these spheres where the two sides are competing intensively. And to downplay that in any way, I think, is just silly. I don't think the Chinese side would downplay it, so I don't see why people in the United States would downplay it either.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Ross, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.